Greetings. I chose as my passage for this assignment to be Mark 10 and verses 42 through 45. In this particular passage, I think the theme of it is servanthood. And when we look at this passage of scripture, I believe that Jesus gives a teaching on servanthood. And the passage starts off in verse 42, where I believe that there is a contrast that is apparent, a contrast between Jesus and 10 of his disciples concerning an event that takes place where James and John, brothers, ask for certain positions in Jesus's kingdom. And in order to understand this, I think we need a broader context to get a grasp on what's taking place in verses 42 through 45. Because in verse number 35, we see that there is a pride issue that is taking place between that of James and John, the two brothers, where they come to Jesus and they tell Jesus to do whatever they ask him to do. And in that, I believe that there is pride because they are assuming some type of role of authority, dictatorship over Jesus, to where he has to subjugate himself to them in doing whatever they desire, meeting their demands. And I think that is a pride issue on the part of the disciples that asked him that, James and John. But not only do we see this particular pride issue, but Jesus clues us in that there's not just pride, but there's a problem that occurs by them asking this of him in verse 38, because he tells them that they really don't know what they're asking for. He says, are you able to drink the cup that I'm drinking, or are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to be baptized with, namely his death? And this is what happens when we operate in pride. We become so self-centered that we do not take into account anything around us, any circumstances, situations, or people, and we're solely focused on ourselves, so much so that we have tunnel vision, that we're not aware of anything else. And this is what Jesus is bringing to light, to bear on them, that they really don't know what they're asking for, and that is a problem. And because of it, the other 10 disciples, when they hear and find out what the two brothers, and even in a different passage of scripture talks about the mother of these two boys or disciples, they get upset that the mother asks as well, and they concur with her and ask too. And the 10 disciples, they get upset. The text clearly denotes that they are greatly displeased. And it would have been a hard thing for those two disciples if these 10 disciples had been in a position of authority to where they could render some type of judgment on them, because I think that they would have sorely displeased them to the extent to where they would not be happy with whatever judgment that came from the 10. But the contrast comes in verse 42, in that Jesus deals with these two disciples quite differently than the 10 deals with them. The 10 were greatly displeased, but Jesus doesn't show any displeasure towards them, but he lovingly embraces them by calling them unto himself. And when he does that, he's this loving shepherd figure that seeks to serve them. Even though he is this great authority in their lives, he takes the position of a servant to give them what they need, to give them what they're lacking, to meet what they really need. And he takes this position of servant amongst them, and he begins to give them a perspective that they need to understand, a contextual perspective of their day and time. And he says in verse 42, after he calls them there, he says, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. And so basically he's saying that the way that the Gentile rulers exercise their authority is by an autocratic type method. A domineering type method. It is one where it is tyrannical, if you will, that they are forced into submission to do whatever the authority's will is. And Jesus gives them this picture of this in verse number 42, and he brings in what I see as a pattern that the disciples ought to take heed to pattern their lives after, because in verse 43 he says, yet it shall not be so among you. He says, but whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. Jesus says, in order to be great, you've got to become a servant. In order to go up the ladder, you got to come down the ladder. And this theme of servanthood begins to take place and show forth. Don't operate in an autocratic type method, a domineering method, but rather go to the position, the lowest position of that of a servant. And so Jesus gives them this pattern for their lives, which is quite different from how James and John probably saw it, for they were probably motivated from a self-absorbed perspective, one that's focused on them to where they could exercise some great authority in Jesus's kingdom that they thought was about to be initiated. And not only do we see that pattern, but we see the principle that Jesus brings to bear for the disciples in verse 45. For he says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom. Jesus uses himself as the principle of how they are to conduct their lives. That he says that even he, being the greatest amongst them, he leaves heaven, he comes to earth, not because he has to, but because he chooses to. He sees what humanity lacks and he desires to meet the need. And he comes from the great wealth and riches and that of splendor of heaven. And he comes to this lowly earth to be born in obscurity, but yet amongst them as a servant. And he says that that's how their lives are to be, just like his is, much like he would later in the upper room as they're celebrating Passover. He girds himself with a towel and he washes the disciples' feet. This was something that they should have done for him, but yet he takes the position of servant to do it for them so that they may gain a lesson from his particular actions. And this is what we see throughout the gospel accounts, is Jesus taking this servant form. He comes to earth and he heals those who are perplexed with some type of sickness, disease. He opens the blinded eyes. He unstops the deaf ears. He causes the mute to speak. He does things for individuals from the position of a servant. He doesn't come as a king, mandating that everybody caters to him, but yet he seeks to do good to all those he comes across. And what this teaches us, the application for us, is that we ought to have this attitude of servitude, that in our lives, as we seek to live out the authority that we have in whatever sphere it is, that we're not to lord our authority over those that we are over, but we are to serve them, that we are to seek to meet their needs as opposed to them meeting our needs. And if we do that, then we would have gained a great lesson from this passage and the teaching of Jesus Christ. Thank you.